أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Respected sisters, brothers, viewers, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Welcome once again to our series, Life, the Islamic Answer, where we are still in the theme of knowledge and reason in Islam. And we have reached the topic of the community of knowledge and how to build it. We discussed the meaning or the definition of the community of knowledge. We established the notion from the Holy Quran and Islamically speaking, and we were in the process of looking at who belongs to the community of knowledge in Islam. And very quickly we said that, of course, the learner and the teacher are the two perhaps most important ingredients, but there are many others. The third one being everyone else. According to the instructions, to the teachings of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, the Imams, we must all find a place in this community of knowledge, one way or another, either as participants or at least as supporters and lovers of these communities of knowledge. And as part of this discussion, we also saw the importance of participating in these communities of knowledge, at least by regular attendance, weekly attendance, and the attendance should be in person as much as possible, as mentioned by a number of narrations that we saw. And then we continued in the process of looking at who else belongs to this community of knowledge. And we said, while we already covered everyone, there is a special emphasis that has to be given to a few categories, either because those categories have been mentioned explicitly or because of their relevance to our lives. And so we mentioned, for instance, children or people in young age. We mentioned women specifically, and we spent a few lectures talking about the role of the family in the community of knowledge. We wanted to, inshallah, finalize this question of who belongs to the community of knowledge with one more participant. And this is a participant that, if we wanted to elaborate in detail, would take us very far and very wide and perhaps a little bit away from our core discussion. And we may have the chance later in the series to come back to these notions. For the time being, we want to focus on what is most relevant to us, and this is the role of the intellectual. The intellectual as a participant in the community of knowledge. It may seem that the question is very simple, but in fact we need to spend a little bit of time analyzing what we mean by the intellectual and understanding why is this even a relevant question. The importance of the question, I think, needs to be discussed before someone thinks that we are wasting our time discussing very abstract notions. In short, what we are going to do with the idea of the intellectual is perhaps not the typical understanding of what is an intellectual. What we mean by the intellectual in our discussion is everyone who wants to engage in cognitive intellectual activities, in our case related to Islam, who is not an expert in Islamic studies or in Islamic sciences, is not an expert in Islam. So anyone who wants to engage in intellectual Islamic activities without necessarily being an expert in Islamic studies and Islamic sciences is the person we are referring to. This is the intellectual, very broad sense. So pretty much everyone in a community who is not the expert in Islam may fall in this category if they want to. Anyone who is not an expert in Islamic studies and Islamic sciences is going to have the potential of being the intellectual we are discussing. That's how we are using the term here. Keep this in mind because it will be a little bit relevant later in the series, later in this specific question, this definition of who is an intellectual. Now the second question, I think, for today, inshallah, and we may continue this the next time we meet as well, is the relevance of this topic. Why are we discussing the role of the intellectual in the way that we defined it in the community of knowledge, in the Islamic community of knowledge? Once we understand the context and the relevance, what we are trying to get at is therefore the role of this person. I think when we look at the others in the community of knowledge, so when we look at, let's say, the learner, let's say the teacher or the scholar, as we discussed the role of the children or the family, for instance, in their role as a family or as a learner or as a teacher, that role is clear. When we come to the intellectual, what we're trying to get at is, what is the role of the intellectual in this community of knowledge? What is to be expected from them, or what should they expect of themselves to do? This becomes even more relevant when we think about the fact that the majority of us in our communities would fall in this category. And this is in large part the relevance of this question. We are not the religious experts in the community. We are not the religious leaders in the community, but we carry some sort of expertise. The expertise is non-religious, but that non-religious expertise opens the door to religious activity, to religious thinking, one way or another. And so the question becomes relevant to everyone in the community. What should be my role as an expert in a non-Islamic field? This is really what we're thinking about. You may be an expert in medicine or engineering or construction or business or accounting. Do you have a role to play in that capacity in your community of knowledge or not? The alternatives or the options that we're going to have are going to be that there is a role, and your role is an active one. You are actively engaged to be a leader in the community with your expertise. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that you are entirely passive and you do not perform any role by yourself actively as an expert in that field. Whatever your field of expertise is, if it is not directly related to Islamic fields, Islamic sciences, then you are entirely passive in that area of expertise in the community. And then perhaps we can call it the middle ground, which may be reactive, so that you react to requests, you react to a need that arises in the community, but other than that, you don't feel like your expertise is to contribute and to play a leadership role in the community based on your area of expertise. Part of the relevance of this discussion, we're not answering questions. Now we're just asking questions, by the way, to kind of steer the discussion eventually, where we want to go and what we're trying to answer. Eventually, depending on how we answer these questions, of course this is going to have an impact on the structure, on our vision or understanding of the structure of a community of knowledge. Depending on whether we say you do play a role or not, whether you play a passive role or an active role and a leadership role or a reactive role, that means that the structure of the community of knowledge is different, because each one of these scenarios means that you're playing a different role. So the structure of that community of knowledge, Islamic community of knowledge, is therefore going to be a different structure. Another point related to the relevance of this topic, and this is what we're going to try to show at a very macro level today, is that if you would look around in our communities, we would argue that this is not a question that is asked, that is posed directly. I don't think that you will be able to find easily, as part of the common discussions and debates and back and forths that happen typically in our communities, in our types of communities, that this is a discussion that is actually taking place. What is the role of the non-religious expert? What is the expert in non-religious studies? What is the role of the community? It does not look like there is an active discussion taking place. And that's why the question may seem odd when we ask it. It doesn't seem to resonate or align with the typical questions we hear in our communities. But I would argue that, in truth, if you were to engage with communities, our community and any other community, you would see that in the lived experience, this is a real lived question. This is something that if you were to ask people, they may not have formulated the words for it yet. But this is something that comes up again and again. People who have something that they feel they can contribute to the community because they carry expertise. The expertise does not necessarily come from a background of religious expertise, an expertise in religious sciences, but they still feel like they have a lot to contribute to that community. And this opens the question to, should they be contributing with that expertise or not? Is there room and space provided for them so that they contribute with that expertise or not? Do others know that that expertise exists? Do the others know that that expertise is required for the community to work together and to improve with time? All of that is not necessarily addressed with the words that we are describing the question. But this is a lived experience in communities. And so therefore, we think this is extremely relevant for a lot of our communities to engage in specifically this question. And there is an implied question underlying all of this. And it has a lot to do with this topic, and I'm trying to steer clear of this question because this question deserves a very lengthy and detailed discussion. And there is perhaps, this is one more area where there is no consensus. It's not a unanimous answer that we will get. We will have to provide different opinions and arguments for each one of these opinions. The underlying question to all of this is whether we believe that Islam as a religion has something to say about every aspect and dimension and angle and affair of the world or not. Ultimately, it comes down to this question. Does Islam have something to say about every aspect of life? Or does it focus on some areas because those areas are much more relevant to our soul, our spiritual well-being, our eternal life in the hereafter, in the afterlife? It focuses on those aspects. And it only talks about the dimensions of this world that affect that aspect. If it talks about anything worldly, it's because that worldly dimension affects the otherworldly dimension. Otherwise, it leaves it to human beings to figure out what they need to figure out and to live however they want. And these are very different ways of understanding what our religion is, what our religion tries to do, how comprehensive our religion is, how much it has to say about the areas that are non-spiritual, let's call them. Depending on that answer, we're going to have a different understanding of the role of the expert in the community if that expertise is outside of religious expertise and religious knowledge. This is implied. This is underlying that whole discussion. I'm not touching it right now. We may get to it later or not, we'll see, depending on the interest. This is a deep and complex discussion, abstract discussion. We may leave it to another time, inshallah. So today what we're going to try to do in the time that we have is to at least try to understand the context for this question. Why do we ask this question? We ask this question because we live in a world where this question is important. In the Islamic world, the question is asked, The question exists. But it's usually a question that is thought about, addressed, written about by the elite, by the intellectuals and the thinkers. It's considered an abstract, complex question. But the question is not originally an Islamic question. This is not something that we need to address simply as Islamic thinkers if we lived in a world where there was only Islam and everything was working perfectly. And the proof is that this is a very recent question. This is not a question that people 10 or 12 centuries were asking. You will not find this question in Islamic scholarship. And our scholars have really thought about everything. They wrote very detailed, very extensive works. This question is nowhere to be found there. Because this is a question that stems from a new reality that did not exist before. These are new realities where we are challenged and we have to think in novel ways to try to come up with solutions to new realities. These realities were not the reality at previous times, in previous centuries. And this became much more a reality in the Western world before it became a reality in the Islamic world. In the Islamic world, it became a reality to a certain extent in the way that it did in the Western world, but in a lot of ways in a different way. But the origin of the discussion started in the West. And then that discussion led to changes in the world and forced the Islamic world to have to think about it. So we have to go back to its roots and start to identify the events, the socioeconomic realities of the Western world that led to the question of what is the role of the intellectual in society? Why is the West wondering about this? So I'm going to try to identify some of the big factors that led to this question in the West, and then we'll turn to the Islamic world. And that will give us the very high macro piece. And then inshallah, when we continue the discussion in the next times, we'll start focusing on the much more practical micro, as they call them, or applied pieces to our own communities. So what happened in the Western world? Before I ask the question, what is the role of the intellectual? And inshallah, this is something we will address in more detail the next time. One big question is, who is an intellectual? And we'll see that there are different understandings. We defined it for our own purposes in our own discussion. But we'll see that in the Western world, there was no agreement on who is the intellectual we're talking about, one. And then the big question is, now that we know who it is, what is their role? But what is the role can mean two things. And I'm already announcing where the discussion will go. First, what is the actual role they are playing today? That's one way to understand what is their role. The other question is, what should be their role in the world? And these are two very different questions. What role do intellectuals play? And two, what role should intellectuals play? The first question is one of description. I simply describe what they're doing. In the second question, I'm asking a moral question. I'm saying what is right and wrong. It's a prescriptive question. What should they be doing? What shouldn't they be doing? And we'll see that in the West, they are asking both questions. We'll get to that later in the discussion. Okay, so let's start with the main factors. The first factor, a huge factor, and a lot of these are in fact declined from the first factor, is what is called the Enlightenment. So we have in the 17th and then 18th centuries, the Western world starts to move towards three things that are very clear and very different. It cuts away its relationship with what was called the traditional worldview. And it moved towards the modern worldview. The modern worldview that started with the Renaissance is built on three elements. The first one is reason. The second one is the individual. And the third one is empirical science. The traditional worldview, so for each one of these, this is what it cut away with. When it says reason, as opposed to what? Reason as opposed to revelation. In the traditional worldview, your truth was revealed to you. In this world, reason has to go find it. The mechanism and the tool that you now have is empirical science. The tool that you used to rely on was religion. And today, or in the modern world, it's about you as an individual. The power comes from you, the will comes from you, the importance is for the individual, which leads to democracy, which leads to human rights, which leads to everything built, centered around the notion of an individual human being. Whereas before, the power is built in an institution that is either the state, the king, or the church, or together. This is the European worldview and the traditional worldview. Muslim thinkers have found a way to take this and translate it into the Islamic world in the same way, once we understand what this is, because they try to analyze and understand whether we can have the same revolution in the Islamic world or not. I'm not going to get into what led to this revolution. What led to letting go of the traditional worldview and getting to the modern worldview through the Renaissance. There's a lot of factors. People were fed up, there was a crisis, they could no longer live in this way, and so on and so forth. A lot of factors. We'll leave it to another time. We've talked about some of these in the past. But this means, if you understand how transformational this is in society, that you go from reason, that you go from revelation and religion and the state and church as your truths, to a world where it's about reason and empirical science and the individual. That movement means that I have to now ask the question, who is an intellectual in this world? And what is the role? Because everything just shifted. What does the intellectual do in this new reality? What were they doing before, and do they continue to do it in the same way? Now that the predominant position is no longer for, let's say, revelation, but for reason. It's no longer about the church and the state, it's about the individual. It's no longer about revealed religion or mythology, as they call it. It's about empirical science. And there's a whole stream of discussion that emerges from this, that perhaps the intellectual can only be secular, can never be religious because of this. This is where this stemmed from. In any case, this is the stem. This is if we go far away into the history. The second factor, the Industrial Revolution. So now you have heavy machinery. You have machines that allow you to do much more work than you were able to do before. Farming, construction, building. And this, with time, makes it very clear that in the world, there are those who have and those who do not have. Those who own, as the Marxists and Marx is going to say, those who own the means of production, and those who do not. Those who have are very few. And they are the ones who create the system. And they create a system where those who do not have remain in a situation where they do not have. Everything in the system is meant for them not to leave their class and get into the class of those who have, because there are limited resources. And this difference of classes is where we start to see a lot of thinking start to take place, with the predominant thinking coming from Marx. He's focused on this specific idea, that now we have classes in society. Yes, there was an industrial revolution, but there are now classes in society. There are people who are living in poverty, deprived. And there are those who can do something about it. But all they do about it is to increase their own capital, increase their own ability to maintain ownership and control, and create systems to ensure that this remains the case in the future. And therefore those who are deprived are going to continue to live in circumstances that never allow them to leave their class. And so their numbers continue to grow, and the numbers of the elites or the top class in society, I don't want to go into the details of Marxist theory. This is in general. And so initially the question was simply, where is the intellectual in all of this? And it seemed clear that the intellectual has maybe a role and a duty to look at this and call things as they are in society and be able to describe the situation. With time, this thinking evolved, however, because there are thinkers who started to take this thinking and analysis, and they started to say, in fact, the intellectual is always contributing to this system. If this system exists, one of its enablers, one of those who allow this system to continue to exist, is the intellectual and the role that they play. And therefore they have a much bigger duty. And this is where we go from describing to the moral judgment. Now the intellectual has to live in a certain way, because you have no choice but to participate in this. What are you doing as an intellectual? What is your role? Your role is always going to be to contribute to this system, to enable this system, to make this system stronger, more powerful. So which institutions are you allowing to perpetuate and to make stronger and more lasting? So that's a whole theme of discussion that started to take place. Then we have the rise of nationalism and the nation state. So before you used to have monarchies, you used to have kings and queens ruling, and now we're moving towards what we call the modern state. And I'm not going to go into the political theory of the moral state, but we have to say this generated a lot of discussion about the role of the intellectual, because it meant that now people have to come within certain geographic and political borders together. You unite people together around something that is common to all of them. But the thing that is common to all of them is artificial. It's a state. It doesn't exist in the outside world. You have to create things around it to make it exist in the outside world. And intellectuals can play a very big role here. You can unite the people around this new state, make them all feel like you belong, you have an identity, or you can criticize the behavior of the state. You can be a critic of what the state is doing. You have both abilities as an intellectual. And depending on which one you're doing, this generates a whole lot of discussion by thinkers that are you betraying the state? Are you a traitor to the state? Or are you performing your duty? If you are a critic, where is your role? Now that we have nation states, and you have those that think bigger, they say no, the intellectual can never be someone who ascribes to a specific state. You have to think beyond the state because you're fully objective. You're only about the truth in the absolute sense. If it's right, you say right. If it's wrong, you say wrong. Your state or a different state has no bearing on your ability to say the truth. Is that truly the case? This is where the whole discussion happens around the nation state and the role of the intellectual in it. And of course here, you get into Friedrich Nietzsche and the philosophy that led to perhaps World War I and World War II and so on and so forth. That's a whole discussion. You have the Russian Revolution and the Marxist thought around it. We talked a little bit about Marxist thought, with the idea that here you can see at play, fully applied, the idea that there are classes. And so are the intellectuals representing their own classes as an intellectual? Can they represent their own class? Is every class represented in the discussion truly? Inshallah, we're going to come back later to some of the thinkers. Gramsci and others talked a lot about this. A lot of very rich thinking around the role of the intellectual. Who is it? And who do they represent? What is their role? We move to the two world wars, or what some have called the crisis of civilization. World War I and World War II. The world is moving by becoming a lot more civilized, applying science. Science is progressing, things are getting better. You would expect human beings to live better lives. So how come the result is World War I? And then human beings should have learned their lessons. This was a fluke. This was an exception. This was a mistake. We learned our lessons. We'll make sure it won't happen again. World War II is a lot worse than World War I. This created a crisis in the intellectual world. A lot of the thinking from the Renaissance until that point just collapsed. The theories were saying that this was going to lead to humanity living truly in a civilized way. It will lead to prosperity and amazing achievements. Progress, scientific progress means we no longer need anything else. Science will tell us how to live. This was a huge movement until World War I and World War II. And then all that thinking collapsed. And this is where you have actual theories called critical theory emerge. We're going to have to add critique or critical theory to everything we do. We have to look at it with a critical perspective. Look at ourselves with a critical perspective. Because if we don't, things may lead to something like World War I and World War II. We have to think about what it means to work towards progress. Is it okay to continue to progress, to move, to improve, let's say, scientifically, industrially, without any moral judgment? Or do we have to add moral judgments to this? Where does that morality come from? And then what roles did the intellectuals play in World War I and World War II? And this was the catastrophe. That in a lot of ways, World War I, and much worse, World War II, would never have been possible without the role of the intellectuals. So what is the role of the intellectual? And how do we ensure that it continues to be a positive role and not the one that was played by many intellectuals that led to the two world wars? We keep on going with the discussion. The Cold War and ideological polarization. After World War II, we see the two superpowers emerge in the world, the United States and Russia, today called Russia. Two superpowers, both of them trying to control what they can in the world, countries allying themselves to one superpower or another, otherwise it becomes impossible for you to operate at an international level, and so on and so forth. For the intellectuals, this caused a huge dilemma. Because intellectuals are supposed to be about the truth. And now, whether they liked it or not, they were always taking sides. No matter what they were doing, it was labeled as either being pro-American or pro-Russian. Was it USSR or was it USA? Any scientific advancement, any progress, any achievement, you're an amazing mathematician, you play chess, anything that you did became translated in the time, in the era of the Cold War, as contributing to the ongoing Cold War between the USSR and the USA. And here the intellectuals had to once again think about, what is my role? And there are many who were revolting against. I live in the West, but I disagree with what they're doing. And it does not make me a traitor to the West. It does not make me a pro-USSR. That's the general narrative that was coming from a lot of the thinkers of that time, a lot of the intellectuals of that time. That was their way of resistance. In any case, I'm not going to go into too far into this discussion. Then we have post-colonialism and decolonialization. The world map is being redrawn around the world. A lot of the countries that were not countries before were under the domination of a superpower before. And now they were revolting. The situation after World War II created a lot of instability. It was no longer tenable for a lot of these superpowers who had lost a lot of their power to continue to colonize in the way that they used to before, where they had colonies. And the colonies were revolting. The colonies want the right to self-determination. I want to be sovereign. I want to be independent. I want to decide for myself my future and how to live, my customs, my food, my dress, my language. I want to decide that. I want to be able to own and manage my own resources on my own land. Not the colony, not the colonialist. Right? So for a very long time, it used to be the UK. That was the dominion, the empire that ruled the world. Wherever you go, they have colonies. They control those colonies. They tell them how to live. They impose laws on them. They impose religion. They impose a language. They impose customs, and so on and so forth. This lasted centuries. Now all of this was changing for all sorts of factors. The role of the intellectual here starts to emerge as contributing to what is called decolonization. That I am no longer, what does it mean that I'm no longer a colony of yours? I'm independent, or I'm supposed to be. What does it mean? Because if the colonial power says, okay, you're on your own, I pull back, are you able to self-govern? Are you able to self-rule, to rule yourself in a way that makes sense? A political system, an economic system, an educational system, a security system, and so on and so forth. Can you do all of that on your own? How are you going to manage all of that? How are you going to organize yourself? And so this became another role for the intellectuals who emerged trying to work in this space that was decolonization or post. This is when you hear there's colonial studies and then there is post-colonial studies. It's how do you now live that you are no longer a colony? And pretty much most of the world was colonies. Africa, Middle East, Asia, elsewhere, Latin America, they were all colonies. Spain, Italy, Portugal, UK, France, Germany, they all had colonized regions. Now all that structure was going away. Of course, the critique to that is colonization continued, but in a much more subtle way, in a different way. And we'll get to that, inshallah. The next factor, the cultural revolutions of 1960s and onwards. So this is where you start to see these individuals who were supposed to have been enabled since the Renaissance, who felt like their rights have been oppressed for a long time. They start to organize themselves, and you have civil rights movements. This is when you start to see feminism. You start to see movements for Black Americans. You start to see minorities emerge and ask for their rights. And this destabilizes and creates a new culture. The existing culture starts to get destabilized. One day, they are an intellectual. They can work as an intellectual. They can influence society as an intellectual. The Martin Luthers of the world and many others like them. A lot of the work of Michel Foucault was definitely in this area. Then you have globalization that was accelerated by, and now we are in a completely different age of information or IT or the internet. And this is a revolution. And this is another theme in the world of the intellectuals, because it means that the ideas, first, are spreading all over the world. Two, they are spreading extremely fast. And three, they are accessible to all. I'll give the radical example. I saw it today, randomly. I saw a video of a man who has Google connected to his brain now. So when he hears someone ask him a question, he doesn't need to do anything. The question enters his ears, his hearing, and it is automatically translated into electric signals, and it's connected to Google. And Google answers. And the answer is downloaded into his brain. And he is able to understand Google's answer through his brain and able to replicate it. It's still preliminary, but this exists today. Still a lot more work required. I'm sure this is still very rudimentary. For abstract thinking and abstract notions, it's probably going to take a little bit longer. But we don't even need to go that far. Simply the use of AI, the availability of the internet, and what AI can do today means what? Means that I have to rethink the role of the intellectual. They were supposed to be an expert, respected for their unique expertise. What does that expertise mean in today's world? If you have any question, what's your question about medicine, engineering, pharmaceuticals, history, philosophy? You can get the answer at your fingertips. And it will keep improving. We're just at the beginning of this. The answer will keep improving. And that's why for the past few years, in the last maybe 10 years or so, there's been a lot of literature, especially in the West. I'm going to give the name of a book, but that name of a book represents that whole theme, and we have to come back to that theme. The death of expertise. Do we still need expertise in society? Do we still need experts? Is expertise still valued and respected? And does it have a clear role? When everyone has a mobile device, a smart device, that has now access to AI tools, that have access to the collective combined knowledge of all of humanity and all of their databases all around the world in a fraction of a second. And of course, I'm talking about the West here, but I said this is the background context, because the truth is, all of this is a reality for all of our communities. Even this last point. To what extent do I need the religious expertise? Will this not do it for me? Or in a world of social media, in a world of the death of the expertise, are we truly looking for the expert? Is the world still structured in a way that you truly have experts? Is the expertise in the content? Or you can be an expert in how to use the social media algorithms, so that your answer is the one that people hear. Not because you're an expert in that field, but because you understand how to use the technology that is now the filter through which people get to any content. Your presence, your availability, the way you use it can go a very long way. In general, and that's why in the West they say the death of expertise. Don't listen to what YouTube says. Don't read the Wikipedia page. Don't look at, what Google says. You have to go and ask the doctor, and whatever the doctor says, that's what you have to listen to. This is certainly an area of frustration right now. There are tensions in society because of this. Well, this applies to everything, religion included. In religion, where are you going to get your information? You don't necessarily any longer need to be an expert in religion to have access to the 17 opinions mentioned in the books. With one click you can get it. And you can make up your own mind. You may not have the tools, you may completely misinterpret, You may completely miss the point, but the information is available. And this alone creates a lot of questions about the role of this person who is not an expert, but who is interested or curious or at least able to engage in cognitive, intellectual abilities without being the expert. How far can it go? You have a historian in Islam, and you have me who can read a few books, click on a few links, watch a few YouTube videos, and make up my mind. And my mind could be very different from what this person says is the established, accepted version of history. I say no. How much weight does that expertise count for in today's world? This is in general, and for relevance for us, what does it mean for our communities? So of course, there was a whole lot of very intense activity in the Western world throughout all of this. I took you from the Renaissance to present day with a lot of big factors. There's a lot more. I'm just trying to focus on the big ones that I think each one of them, we don't have time for me to draw the link from each one of them to our Islamic reality. I think you guys can do that. We have to do the same thing in the Islamic world. We're out of time. So inshallah, next time we meet, we'll cover the macro, high-level, socioeconomic factors in the same way that happened in the Islamic world. They were different. They were not these. Some of these overlap, but a lot of them are different. The fall of the Ottoman Empire is a different reality in the Islamic world than what we described here. The Islamic world never experienced a Renaissance. It experienced other things, the opposite. And the reaction of it led to having to rethink what is the role of the intellectual in the Islamic world. What is the role of the intellectual in society? What is the role, therefore, for us of the intellectual in our communities? The conclusion from all of this, and I will end with this today, that was supposed to be the conclusion, and it will be inshallah next time we meet, but just so that we know where we're headed. The conclusion for us, and the reason why I'm talking about this, at the macro level, at the high level, is that as communities, as minorities living in the West, we are stuck in two realities. We are stuck with this entire reality that we just described in a society, in a world that has gone through all of these changes that we just described in the Western world. This is our reality. We are in it today. And two, all the changes that we're going to describe that took place in the Islamic world, we also carry those as our background and our heritage. And in us, both converge, because we live as minorities, communities in the West. So we have to look at what happened in the Islamic world and what happened in the Western world to try to see how do we need to adapt and how do we need to customize ourselves, adjust ourselves for this type of reality. What happened in the Western world started to permeate, to slip into the Islamic world. For some of it, as is. Some of it with distortions. And some of it has barely made it to the Islamic world. For us, we are living in it 100%. We have to understand what it is. And inshallah, in the next part of the series, we're going to focus a little bit more on this. We talked about the types or the kinds of knowledge that our religion says we have to learn. One of them is, one of the most important ones is to understand the world in which we live. We live in the Western world. I have to understand this reality as is. It applies to me in a very different way than it applies to someone who lives fully immersed in the Islamic world, completely cut off from the Western world. They have a completely different reality. And two, I am not only the Western world. If I'm a Muslim, I'm carrying baggage. I'm carrying heritage. I'm carrying those factors that I haven't talked about, inshallah, this is the next time we meet, All of this is part of my reality today as a Muslim. So I have to see as a community, when all of this converges, what do I have to do with it to help me figure out how to structure myself, how to be a community of knowledge, and what is the role of the intellectual in that community. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.